Yeah, perfect weather. Excuse me, coming through. Watch your step there.
My wife died in a car accident 7 years ago, or at least that's what I believed every single day I woke up without her. Every morning I reached across an empty bed. Every night I locked the door to a house that had gone quiet in a way only grief can make it quiet. The kind of silence that presses against your ears until you learn to live inside it. And for 7 years I carried that silence with me like a second spine, straightening my posture when I needed to function and collapsing inward when no one was watching because the accident had been sudden, brutal, final. A drunk driver on a rain-slick highway, a police officer standing on my porch with his hat in his hands, words that sounded rehearsed but still shattered everything they touched. They told me the car caught fire. They told me identification was difficult. They told me there would be no open casket. And I nodded like a man watching someone else's life fall apart. Because that's how shock works. It gives you distance so you don't drown all at once. And I signed papers. I identified belongings. I held my daughter as she screamed into my chest, and I buried the woman I loved more than anything I ever had or ever would, or so I thought, because life has a way of teaching you that certainty is often just comfort dressed up as truth. And for years afterward, I lived exactly how widowers are expected to live. I became quieter, smaller, more careful with joy. I stopped buying 2 coffees in the morning, stopped leaving the bathroom light on for someone else, stopped saving the corner pieces of cake she liked, and I told myself that moving forward didn't mean forgetting, it meant surviving. So I survived, I raised our daughter, I paid the bills, I smiled at the right moments, I visited her grave on Sundays and talked to a headstone like it could hear me. I told her about promotions and birthdays and how our daughter was growing up too fast, and sometimes I swore I could almost feel her listening, because grief doesn't erase love, it sharpens it. And then one ordinary Tuesday afternoon, years later, after work, after errands, after a day so painfully normal it felt like an insult to everything I'd been through, I stopped at the grocery store on the way home. The same one we used to go to together, the same aisles, the same dull music overhead, the same smell of overripe bananas and disinfectant. And I was standing near the produce section comparing apples because she used to insist on Honeycrisp even when they were more expensive, and that memory alone was enough to sting. When I felt it first, not saw it, felt it. That strange pull you get when someone familiar is near, the kind you dismiss because you don't want to reopen old wounds. And then I heard her laugh, not a generic laugh, not something my mind could invent, but her laugh. The one that started soft and ended in a breathy little hitch like she was surprised by her own joy, and my body reacted. Before my brain could stop it, my heart dropped, my vision narrowed, my hands went cold, and when I turned, slowly, carefully, afraid that if I moved too fast, the illusion would break, I saw her standing 3 aisles away, holding a basket, arguing playfully with a man about cereal. Her hair a little shorter, her face slightly older but undeniably her. The same curve of her mouth, the same tilt of her head when she was amused, the same scar above her eyebrow from when she fell as a teenager and pretended it didn't hurt, and my knees nearly gave out because this wasn't grief or memory or imagination. This was physical, tangible, impossible reality standing under fluorescent lights comparing prices. And for a moment my brain tried to protect me by offering explanations that didn't require my entire understanding of the world to collapse. I thought maybe I'd finally snapped. Maybe grief had finally finished its slow work on me. Maybe my mind had decided to resurrect her as a coping mechanism. But then she reached out, touched the man's arm, and the way she did it, the exact pressure, the familiarity, erased any remaining doubt because no one else in the world touched like that. And before I could stop myself, I said her name, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for it to exist between us. Emily. And she froze. Just for half a second, like a prey animal sensing danger. Then she turned, and our eyes met. And I saw something I will never forget. Not recognition, not relief, not love, but fear, pure and immediate, the kind that doesn't have time to think, the kind that knows before it understands. And she stared at me like I was a ghost, like I was the impossible thing standing in front of her. And then she did something that hurt worse than any funeral ever could. She looked away, grabbed the man's arm, and walked quickly toward the exit without saying a word, without explaining, without even denying it. And I stood there shaking, surrounded by strangers who had no idea my entire past had just collided with my present, and something inside me broke open. Not grief this time, but resolve, because hallucinations don't run away, and dead people don't avoid eye contact. And I left my cart right there and followed her outside, my heart pounding so hard I could taste metal. And by the time I reached the parking lot, they were already pulling out, the man driving, her head turned toward the window, and I memorized the license plate like my life depended on it. Because in that moment, it did, and I went home and sat at my kitchen table until midnight staring at nothing, replaying every second, every detail, every micro-expression, until denial had nowhere left to hide. And over the next weeks I became someone I barely recognized, not reckless, not angry, but focused in a way grief had never allowed. I hired a private investigator, quietly, carefully, because I needed truth more than comfort now. And what I learned dismantled the version of my life I'd been living piece by piece. I learned that the accident report had inconsistencies, that the fire had been real but the body identification had been rushed, that dental records had been incomplete, that a woman matching Emily's description had been treated at a hospital 2 counties away that same night under a different name, discharged quietly, that financial accounts had been opened months before the accident, accounts I had never known about, that phone records showed calls made from a burner phone I couldn't trace, and each discovery hurt in a new way, because it wasn't just that she was alive, it was that she had planned to disappear, that the life I mourned hadn't been stolen by fate but abandoned by choice. And when the investigator finally confirmed her new identity, her new address, her new life, complete with a different last name and a marriage license filed 3 years after her death, I sat alone in my car and screamed until my voice gave out, not because I wanted her dead, not because I wanted revenge, but because the woman I trusted most had let me bury her while she watched from somewhere else, had let our daughter believe her mother was gone, had let me build a life around loss that didn't need to exist. And eventually I did what I had to do. I confronted her, not in anger, not in public, but with evidence. I stood outside the house she now lived in, a modest place in a quiet neighborhood. And when she opened the door and saw me, there was no pretending left, no running, no fear this time, just exhaustion. And she invited me inside like a stranger. And we sat at a table that wasn't mine and talked for hours. And she told me everything. About debt she never told me about mistakes she thought she couldn't survive, about fear that turned into desperation, and desperation that turned into a plan she convinced herself was mercy. She told me she believed we'd be better off without her, that starting over somewhere else was the only way she knew to breathe again. And I listened, not because I agreed, but because after 7 years of silence I deserved the truth. And when she asked me what I wanted, what I was going to do, I surprised both of us by saying I didn't know yet, because grief changes you, but betrayal rebuilds you. And the version of me sitting there wasn't the same man who stood at her grave all those years ago. And in the end, I didn't expose her. I didn't destroy her new life, not out of kindness, not out of weakness, but because my daughter deserved to choose what truth she carried. And some truths need timing as much as they need courage. And I walked away that night knowing that death had taken less from me than deception had, but also knowing that I was no longer trapped inside a lie I didn't create. And sometimes that is the beginning of a different kind of freedom, one that doesn't erase pain but finally gives it a name. The night after, I confronted her. I didn't sleep at all, not because I was replaying what she said, but because my body finally understood something my mind had been avoiding for years, that the grief I thought I had healed from was never actually grief. It was suspension, a long pause where my life waited around a death that never happened, and now that pause had ended violently, ripping time forward all at once. And as the hours crawled by, I realized I wasn't mourning my wife anymore. I was mourning the version of myself who believed in her without question. The man who thought love automatically meant honesty. The man who never imagined that the person sleeping beside him could be quietly preparing an escape while he planned a future. And when the sun finally came up, I felt older than I had the day the police knocked on my door, because this pain didn't come with casseroles or sympathy or rituals. It came with paperwork, lies, and 1,000 unanswered questions. The biggest one being what this meant for our daughter, who by now was nearly grown, who had built her identity around the absence of a mother, who had processed that loss in her own private ways. And I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that whatever I did next would change her life permanently. Not just emotionally, but structurally, because truth doesn't enter a family quietly once it's been delayed this long. It arrives like an earthquake, and for weeks after that confrontation, I lived 2 lives at once. One where I went to work, cooked dinner, answered emails, and smiled when appropriate, and another where every quiet moment was filled with investigation, not because I wanted to punish Emily, but because I needed to understand the full scope of what had been taken from us. And the deeper I looked, the more unsettling it became, because her disappearance wasn't a moment of panic. It was a series of calculated steps that stretched back over a year before the accident, small. Withdrawals from joint accounts, personal documents quietly duplicated, credit reports pulled without my knowledge, and when I traced it all back, I saw a woman slowly separating herself from a life she had already decided to leave, while I was still believing we were standing on the same ground. And what made it worse was that there were moments I could now reinterpret with brutal clarity. Late-night walks, she said, helped her sleep. Phone calls she took outside. Sudden interest in insurance policies and legal details she claimed were just being responsible. And I hated myself for not seeing it then, even though I knew hindsight was a cruel trick that pretended warning signs were obvious when they never are in real time. And eventually, I had to face the question I'd been avoiding: whether to tell our daughter, because keeping the truth to myself was becoming its own form of betrayal. And yet the idea of destroying the narrative she had built to survive felt unbearable, because grief, when it's processed honestly, leaves scars but also strength. And I didn't know what truth delayed by 7 years would do to someone who had already done the work of letting go. And for a long time I told myself I was protecting her by waiting. But one evening, while sorting through old photos, I found a picture of Emily holding our daughter at the same grocery store where I'd seen her alive. Both of them laughing, frozen in a moment I had believed was sealed forever. And something inside me shifted, because that photo wasn't evidence of loss anymore. It was evidence of theft, of years taken from a child who deserved answers. And I decided then that truth wasn't something I could manage forever. It was something that had to be faced, even if it shattered what remained of our fragile peace. And when I finally sat my daughter down weeks later at the same kitchen table where I had once helped her with homework and comforted her through nightmares about losing her mother, my hands shook in a way they hadn't since the funeral, and I told her slowly, carefully, without embellishment, that her mother hadn't died, that she was alive, that I had seen her, that I had spoken to her, and the look on my daughter's face will stay with me for the rest of my life. Not shock exactly, not anger right away, but confusion so deep it looked like the world had suddenly stopped making sense. And she asked the kinds of questions only a child raised by grief would ask. Whether she had done something wrong, whether her mother didn't love her, whether all those years of missing her had been unnecessary. And I answered honestly, even when honesty hurt more than silence ever had. And she cried in a way that was different from the grief she had known before. Sharper, angrier, filled with betrayal rather than loss. And in the days that followed, our home became a place of raw emotion. Not dramatic confrontations, but quiet devastation, long silences, punctuated by sudden tears, anger that had nowhere to go, and questions neither of us could fully answer, because understanding why someone leaves is not the same as accepting it. And eventually my daughter made a choice I had promised myself I wouldn't interfere with. She asked to meet her mother, not to reconcile, not to forgive, but to see for herself the person who had become a ghost while still breathing. And when the 3 of us sat in that living room, years of unspoken history pressed down on every word, Emily cried, apologized, explained, justified, contradicted herself, and our daughter listened, arms crossed, eyes hard, absorbing everything without offering comfort. And when it was over, she stood up, thanked her mother for answering her questions, and said something that still echoes in my head, that death would have been easier, because death doesn't choose. And that was the moment I knew there was no version of this story where everyone healed neatly, because survival built on lies leaves damage that truth can't always undo. And after that meeting, Emily reached out several times, not demanding reconciliation, not asking to return, but seeking permission to exist in some form that didn't make her feel like a villain. And I realized something uncomfortable, that while I could explain her actions, even empathize with the fear that drove them, forgiveness wasn't something I could manufacture on command, because forgiveness isn't just about understanding someone else's pain. It's about reconciling it with your own. And my pain was no longer rooted in absence. It was rooted in erasure, in being written out of a decision that defined my life. And as months passed, I focused on rebuilding something solid with my daughter, not pretending the past hadn't happened, but refusing to let it dictate our future. And slowly, painfully, we adjusted to a new reality where grief and anger existed side by side, where birthdays were complicated, holidays carried extra weight, and the idea of family became something we defined ourselves rather than inherited. And sometimes late at night, I still think about that grocery store aisle, about how close I came to walking away, about how easily I could have dismissed what I saw as imagination and continued living inside a lie that felt safer than truth. And I understand now that closure isn't something life hands you when you're ready. It's something you claim when you're tired of pretending, because the hardest part of losing someone isn't believing they're gone. It's discovering they chose to leave and deciding how much power that choice still has over you.